The Duchy of Lancaster and the Manor of Aldbourne. This is a talk which was originally presented to the Heritage Group meeting in August 2015. As you'll see, there are a couple of facts which we believe then that are now somewhat in dispute, and we'll mention those as we come to them. For many years, it was believed, and some people still claim, that the first historical mention of Aldbourne was in the will of King Alfred the Great in 899 AD. There it states, "And to Alfhelm, my brother's son, the manor at Aldbourne." And Aldbourne had always been taken to mean Aldbourne. However, if we continue that same sentence in the will, it actually says, "And to Alfhelm, my brother's son, the manor at Aldbourne, and at Compton, and at Crundle, and at Beedon, and at Beddingham, and at Burnham, and at Thunderfield, and at Eashing." Now, Compton, Crundle, Beedon, Beddingham, Burnham, Thunderfield, and Eashing, those are all villages and settlements in West Sussex, or just over the border in a couple of cases in Hampshire and Surrey, but clustered together. So it's very likely that this reference to Aldbourne is to the village of Aldbourne, close to Chichester, and not to the Aldbourne that we know, almost 90 miles away. Whoever it belonged to in 899, it passed through inheritance through several generations to the Earl Godwin. And when he died in 1053, it passed to his widow, the Lady Geitha, mother of King Harold. King Harold, of course, was killed at the Battle of Hastings, and immediately following the battle in 1066, the new King William seized Aldbourne as part of his royal domain. And he took Aldbourne Chase and Aldbourne Warren. They were created as a deer hunt and as a rabbit warren for the exclusive use of the king's court. And he appointed a man called Walleran as the steward. What we know about Aldbourne at that time is summarised in the Domesday Book, which was compiled in 1086. And here is the entry for Aldbourne. You can see it's written in very abbreviated Latin, effectively in code. But the first line is fairly readable. It says, "Rex tenuit Aldbourne, Geitha tenuit TRE, tempore regis Edwardi." That translates as the king holds Aldbourne. Geitha held it in the time of King Edward, in other words, before the conquest. If we translate the rest of that entry, it tells us that there were 156 households in the village, including 14 freedmen, and there were 25 slaves. It's quite a big village, one of the larger villages in the country. There was enough land for 47 ploughs, and the Lord himself had 12 ploughs, and the other men of the village held 26 ploughs between them. There were 4 mills, probably water mills, so the stream was had much more water in it than we know today. And the village also had a church, and it also held 4 large properties in Cricklade, which, as we know, is sort of 20 miles away. A big, rich, prosperous village. As was common with royal manors at the time, Aldbourne passed through many different hands as people came in and out of the king's favour, until in 1250, the Earl of Salisbury, William Longsby, held Aldbourne, and in 1250 he assigned Upham, the estate of Upham, to Laycock Abbey, which his wife, the Countess Ella, had recently founded. The next we hear is in 1285, when an entry appears in the records of the Selkley 100 complaining that the Countess Ella has failed to pay her taxes for Upham for the past 16 years, and that something had to be done to persuade her to pay. There are no further records that tell us whether she ever did. Back in 2015, and for many, many years before that, it was believed that in 1365, Aldbourne was passed by the then Earl of Salisbury to John of Gaunt in settlement of a debt of some kind. We now know that that's not true. It came to John of Gaunt through a long chain of inheritances from the Earl of Salisbury, but at some point during that chain, it had been diverted and had became into the possession of a completely different family. And in 1365, John of Gaunt went to court to prove his right to Aldbourne, and he was successful. So as we knew, 1365, it did indeed become the property of John of Gaunt. This sequence of events and the court case, that was subject of a talk which we gave in January 2020. On John of Gaunt's death, Aldbourne passed to his son, who later became Duke of Lancaster, and thus Aldbourne became part of the Duchy of Lancaster. It remained part of the duchy until 1626, when Charles I got into severe debts with the City of London and handed over to them many of his manors in settlement of his debt. Aldbourne, as part of that settlement, was valued at £3,600. Now, I've bandied about words like manor and hundred without any explanation, but what actually did they mean? A manor is the smallest unit of royal government, similar to a modern civil parish. The king owns the land, and he assigns it to one of his supporters as tenant-in-chief, who thus becomes the lord of the manor. And although he may behave as though he owns the land, and he collects the rents and the other dues from all the tenants of the manor, he actually only holds it as long as he remains in the king's favour. The king could, and frequently did, dispossess the lord if he defied the king in some way. Manors were grouped together in lots of about a dozen or so into the next layer of government, which were known as the hundreds. Aldbourne was, and still is, ceremonially, part of Selkley 100. The hundreds, similarly, were grouped into shires or counties, and with it, and Selkley, and with it, of course, Aldbourne, were part of Wiltshire. Manors were the English class system in microcosm. At the top, the probably absent lord and his local representative, the steward, and then a few free men who held their land directly from the king, then tenants who held their land from the lords, serfs who had no land but were probably housed by their employer, and they owed service to the lord in exchange for their rights on the common land. And finally, at the very bottom of the pile, landless slaves. The serfs of the manor were organised into groups of about 10 or 12 householders, which were called tithings. Each tithing was required to send a representative to each manor court. and each member of a tithing was jointly responsible and possibly jointly punished for any misdemeanour by any one of his fellow members. The Manor Court had developed from the provisions of the laws of King Athelstan, which had been instituted in the early 10th century. It would be held in each manor every 6 months and had two distinct parts. First came the view of frank pledge, and that was followed by the court baron, or as it was sometimes known, the court leet. The view of frank pledge was comparable to today's parish council meetings. There were no fixed councillors. Instead, 12 of the tenants of the village were sworn to discuss and decide the matters that came before them, and they were called the homage. They heard reports about problems in the village, disputes between villagers, even from time to time, such things as fighting and disturbances. They were also responsible for what we would now know as trading standards. Each year they elected a villager as ale taster, whose job it was to go round to the local ale houses and ensure that there was no beer was not being watered. They would elect a bread weigher who did the same thing for the bakers to make sure that the bread was pure. To the leather sealer who went to all the cobblers and leather workers to make sure that their leather was properly prepared. They would also elect one or possibly two constables whose job was keeping order within the manor. And they elected also people whose job it would be to maintain the assets of the manor. So the woodward would have the job of looking after the woodland, the hayward looking after the common land, and there would be people to survey the highways and so forth. Here's an example of a page of the court book of Laycock from 1668. It's a bit later than the time we're talking about, but it's easier to read. The page starts with an introduction to this sitting of the court. It says, in Latin, because this is an official part, Liberty and Manor of Laycock, Court of View of Frank Pledge and Court Baron of Francis Finch, Esquire, Roland Berkeley and John Talbot, held the 25th day of March in the 20th year of King Charles I, 1668. Jonathan Rogers, Steward. Then the next section is the list of the jury. This is effectively, the jury of the court, because they're going to hear things which are effectively offences. And here is the list. They include Thomas Rock, Richard Drew, John Bond, Stephen Staunton, Anthony Billett, John Barrett, William Griffith, George Doomer, Thomas Drew, Robert Drew, John Duck, John Street, and Richard Grist Sr. The next section are the two constables, Richard Barrett and Thomas Baker. And then we have a tithing man for Notton, David Sylvester. Notton is a small group of houses, a small hamlet, about half a mile from the village of Laycock itself. So they sent their own representative to the Manor Court. Then we have the business of the court, which are known as presentments. The first says, the tenants of the manor need a bull and a boar, which had formerly been presented and ought to be provided by Sharrington Talbot, Esquire, the owner of the parsonage of Laycock. So it was obviously the custom that whoever owned the parsonage provided a bull and a boar to service all of the animals of the tenants of the manor, and Mr. Talbot had failed to do so. The second, the town needs crooks and ladders which have not been provided, despite being presented before. So people in the town, they needed crooks and ladders to fight fires. The crooks would be used to pull straw down from thatched roofs. So this was firefighting equipment. And they'd complained previously to the lord of the manor that it was his job to provide firefighting equipment, and he'd not done so. Next, it tells us that William Bond, George Bond, and others have not reformed the encroachment according to an order made at the last court, fined 20 shillings each. So William and George Bond and some other people, they built hovels, small sheds or some kind of building on Bewley Common, which they were not entitled to do, and they'd been ordered by the previous court to remove them, and they'd not done that, and so they were being fined 20 shillings each. They still had to remove their hovels. The view of frank pledge was followed by the court baron. All tenants and freeholders were obliged to attend and could be fined if they failed to attend. The court baron made decisions on matters of property and ownership within the village. It dealt with the administration of the property of the manor, tenancies, common land disputes, and the like. The most frequent matters, of course, were the tenancies, granting of leases, amending them, transferring them, or even surrendering them. Every few years, the court baron would order a perambulation, and this activity has come down to us as beating the bounds. A group of tenants would walk the boundary of the manor, recording all landmarks and ensuring that those noted in previous perambulations were still in place and easily visible. A record of the perambulation would then be written up in the court book. Here's an example of the grant of a tenancy. It comes from the court book of Laycock for 1707. Note that until 1726, unlike the view of frank pledge, which apart from its introduction was all in English, the decisions of the court baron were recorded not in English but in Latin. So this entry is in Latin, and translated it says, "To this court came James Lancaster and Mercy his wife, and took from the hands of the Lord one messuage," one house, one garden, one orchard, 2 barns with an adjoining close of arable land, which was previously held by Ludwig Waite, and of about 1½ acres, and 1 close of arable land called Ashley of about 4 acres, formerly held by John Mortimer, to have and to hold for the lives of the aforesaid Mercy, Robert Lancaster, and Dorothy Lancaster, son and daughter of James and Mercy Lancaster, rent paid annually of 16 shillings, and a fine to the Lord of £100. Now, the fine in this case is not a punishment, it's simply the money which had to be paid to the Lord. Effectively, we'd now think of it as buying the leasehold. But this document is interesting because it shows us a couple of things to do with holding of land in those days. The first is that this entry is effectively a lease for that land to James Lancaster. And a copy would be made of that on a piece of parchment and would be given to James Lancaster. And because he held his land as a result of that copy of the entry in the court book, that type of tenancy was known as copyhold. The other interesting thing is that we see that 2/3 of the way down the English translation, to have and to hold for the lives of the aforesaid Mercy, Robert Lancaster and Dorothy Lancaster. A lease was generally given for the lives, for the duration of the lives of 3 people. So Robert and Dorothy would be the youngest 2 of James and Mercy's children, so that they expected the lease to hold for as long as possible, because the youngest person would be mentioned on it. When, for instance, James Lancaster died, or one of the other people listed died, whoever held the lease at that point, James or Mercy, would come back to the court and ask the court to change the lease to 3 different lives, or maybe 2 the same and 1 new one. And that could go on, that change of adding extra lives on to the end of a 3-life lease could go on for many, many generations. It finally came to an end sometime in the 1920s. So, where can we look for records of the history of Aldbourne? The first place to look is in the Discovery database of the National Archives. If you Google Discovery National Archives, you'll come up with the link to that website. Discovery holds details of records held by archives across the country, including over 1,600 relating to Aldbourne. 300 odd of them are held by the National Archives themselves in Kew. But the vast majority, some 900 or so, are held by the Wiltshire and Swindon History Centre at Chippenham. There are several hundred others in archives around the country. And all of these records, all of these documents, way back to the 1200s, you can go and ask to read every single one of them. I've looked at many of the early documents held at Kew. One of the most interesting is what's known as the rental of the Manor of Aldbourne. It was drawn up for Henry VIII in 1509, the first year of his reign. He needed to know how much income he would receive annually from each of his manors. And this document lists all of the tenants of the Manor of Aldbourne and the rent they paid. It starts, Aldbourne, rent roll renewed the 12th day of September in the first year of the King Henry VIII, before the court of John Fitzjames, Thomas Hobson and others. You'll notice that it's all in Latin. Before William Walrand, gentleman, John Goddard, John Gain, Richard Spanswick, John Castell, William Wade, Francis Bacon, William Sparrow, Thomas Shepherd, Christopher Wilde, Thomas Holt, William Cokes, Richard Seaton, Thomas Selwood, Nicholas Luffin alias Braze, Walter Pole, William Hatt, Thomas Conning, John Noxton and John Collingbourne. Now, all those gentlemen were commissioners appointed by the king to go out and find this kind of information. And then it goes on, the domains of the liberty. John West Street. John York, knight, holds one burgage and a curtilage of a parcel of land formerly held by Richard Wootton, for which he pays as rent per year 3 shillings and 4pence. And the entry at the bottom, William Hatt holds one messuage and one vergate of land formerly held by William Atwell, for which he pays as rent 6 shillings. We carry on. Here we've got the entry for William Coates, and now we've moved from West Street to the next part of the village, High Street, which is the area around the green. And we have 2 more, Richard Yates and Edward Burgess, are the next entries here in the list. Carrying on, still in the High Street, we find that one of the tenants are the procurators of the Fraternity of St. Mary of Aldbourne, hold 2 burgages formerly in the hands of Alice Shepherd, for which they pay per year 2 pence. And the OB at the end tells us that the 2 pence is still outstanding from the previous year, that they're behind, that they're in arrears of their rent. The procurators of the Fraternity of St. Mary of Aldbourne, they were created in the 1400s by the Goddard family when the St. Mary's Lady Chapel was built, where now you'll find the tomb of the Walrond brothers. And the Goddards endowed a fraternity of priests to say daily mass in that Lady Chapel in their honour. And here's another entry which starts, this would have followed one about John Mitchell. It says, the same John Mitchell holds a burgage and 1 vergate of land in halfway along the second line of this, in Lotwich. So here's a mention of Lottage. He pays 5 shillings and 4pence a year, so it's obviously quite a large piece of land. As well as the properties within the village, there are also sections for places like Snap, Upham, Baden, Hillwood and Pikewood, Wanborough, and the hamlet of Woodhouse. You'll find that document with a translation of the entries in the Heritage Centre in a binder, which you can look at. Very, very welcome to look at. Slightly later, there's another group of documents which record a survey of Aldbourne Chase. And that was held on behalf of Queen Elizabeth in 1560 and 1561. It's one of a mass of documents recording surveys of manors belonging to the Duchy of Lancaster, which are held together in a large and rather untidy and rather dirty and dusty box. I had to go delving deep into that box to find the paper that I wanted. And here it is. It calls itself The Inquisition into Aldbourne Chase, and it's written on a series of parchment skins. It starts with a series of questions which are to be asked of every witness to the inquiry. And the questions are listed on this parchment. How long have you known the Chase and Prior's Wood? Has it belonged to the Crown all this time? Has anyone other than the Queen, her ministers or officers hunted there? Has the warrener, Thomas Waldron, set vermin traps in the wood? If so, how many? Notice this surname Waldron. That's very clearly a descendant of the man Walleran, who was the original steward appointed by King William in 1066 or so. Has the woodward coppiced the wood each autumn, and has he the personal use of 1 acre of wood as his fee? Is the tithe paid to the vicar of Aldbourne or of Ogbourne? Where is the boundary between the Chase and the parish of Ogbourne? Has the wood always belonged to the Crown, irrespective of which parish it's in? Have the people of Ogbourne ever had free use of the wood? Have the keepers of the wood shredded foliage as feed for the deer in times of need? And has Vincent Goddard or his servants or friends hunted in the Chase and Wood since last Christmas? Then we have a series of witness statements, which start: the deposition of certain persons examined on interrogatories by Thomas Walleran on behalf of our Sovereign Lady the Queen, taken at Dudmore Lodge in the Chase of Aldbourne in the county of Wilts on the 28th day of November 1560, as ensueth. And here's the first deposition. Robert Hall of Aldbourne, of the age of 80 years or thereabouts, sworn and examined the day and year above written. To the first interrogatory, he say he knoweth the Chase called Aldbourne Chase, and the wood called Prior's Wood, and hath known the one and the other 50 years. To the second interrogatory, he deposeth that the Queen's Majesty and her ancestors have always had free chase through the said wood called Prior's Wood, both for deer and conies, all the time of his remembrance, without impeachment of any persons, till of late years. And so it goes on through a series of a dozen or so witnesses, each answering those 11 questions. A third document from slightly later still is the well-known map of Aldbourne Chase prepared for a court case in 1608. The authorities of the Duchy of Lancaster were becoming increasingly concerned about unauthorized people hunting deer and rabbits on the Chase. Indeed, some families were treating parts of the Chase as though it were their own property. King James I and VI took the Walleran family to court to prove the ownership and the use of the land and assets of the Chase. Rex versus Walleran. This wonderfully illustrated map is studded with snippets of text pasted onto relevant features of the Chase. One example reads, "This coppice is called Hartis Hook and is claimed to be Walleran's inheritance, but the King's tenants have the pasture thereof, and the King hath the conies." It's fairly clear from this that the Wallerans, and from some of the labels also the Goddard family, were trying to claim parts of this land as their own property. A copy of the map, with transcriptions of all the text on it, is one of the displays in the Aldbourne Heritage Centre. A copy and translation of the 1509 rental is also on display in the centre. And we hope you'll soon be able to come to the centre, and we hope you'll be able to see them for yourself and enjoy them as much as we have. And that's the end of our talk. Thank you so much for listening.